Bill Nye, aka the science guy, has added his voice to the chorus of genetic scientists who insist that race is nothing but a human construct. As he has said, if someone from Papua New Guinea has a child with someone from Sweden, their child is a human. Looked at from a perspective of DNA, there really is no such thing as African or Asian or Native American, Latino, Caucasian, Eskimo. The differences among humans are subtle and genetically insignificant. I don't get to talk about philosophy very often, and I'm sure that's one of the things that most of you count your lucky stars for. But there's one philosopher that I had to study when I was in college that didn't make much sense to me at the time, but he's kind of growing in my appreciation in recent years. Ludwig von Wittgenstein was a British Austrian philosopher who talked about the philosophy of mind and of language. And I remember my professor explaining Wittgenstein to us, saying that if you look at a table from above the table and then look at it from underneath the table, that you're seeing two different tables. It's not the same table. And I'm, 19 years old sitting in the back of the class and yeah, it is. But it really seemed like kind of a waste of tuition money to me at the time. But the truth is that your perspective determines your truth. I'm all about evidence-based faith. I like to root my religion and my reality in scientific facts, but perspective is a determinant of your experience of the truth. It is true that there is, from the perspective of science, no such thing as race. Bill Nye can build a good case for saying that. We are all humans. But if you ask a black person if there is such a thing as blackness, that is, has growing up being identified as black had any influence on your experience of life? Well, their reality is not Bill Nye's reality, is it? Bill Nye is trying to defuse the myths of white privilege and minority prejudice, but he's in some ways denying its reality. The fact that it is still an element of society. It's a factor. It's something we have to deal with. And I can say the amen to scientists' attempts at saying we have outgrown racism. We've outgrown these distinctions based on genetic subtleties. And yet to deny that Latinos experience what it means to be Latino and not a part of the dominant majority of society, or that blacks don't experience issues for being identified as a minority, is to not deal in reality. Their perspective is real enough. Viewed from a scientific perspective, okay, but that's not the only perspective. Now, we're all decent people here. I know most of you. You're pretty good folks. None of us here want to be racist. All of us would love to be able to eradicate racism from our society. And we've made progress just in my lifetime. I've seen a lot of aspects of the racism in America dramatically improve. But when the Black Lives Matter movement began, there were a lot of us, good, well-intended white folks, who may have stumbled into a somewhat confused response in saying all lives matter. Even Bernie Sanders, the first time a Black Lives Matter group came up on stage when he was speaking, he was sincerely confused about why they were there. And his first response was the first response that many of us made. All lives matter. Now, Bernie's a Jewish guy living in Washington, D.C., so being in a minority is not new territory for him. But even a seasoned progressive liberal who did march in the civil rights marches of the 60s, who has been active in addressing racism, even he couldn't see the reality from a black perspective. There are times when white folk have to shut up and listen. The truth is that there has never been a time in American history when it wasn't obvious that white lives matter. There's not a white lives matter movement because we've never needed one. We have a long history of institutionally and individually insisting that black lives do not matter. And so the alternative needs to be stated, and needs to be stated loudly and frequently. And those of us who even believe that we are woke to this issue, even those of us who live in interracial families, need to calm down enough to be able to listen and to ask more questions than we offer opinions, and see if we can grow a little bit in these areas. Now, not since the days of Clarence Thomas hearings in 1991 has the issue of sexual harassment been in the news as much as it has been since the case of Harvey Weinstein gained media attention. Sex scandals are not all uncommon for an entire generation now, but the coercion of sex from women by powerful men has been an especially nauseating bit of news lately, with Roger Ailes and Bill O'Reilly and any number of other powerful, famous men who have coerced women based on career development issues into sexual relationships. Sex scandals are not at all uncommon for any time in American history, but lately it appears that some of the people that we didn't want to think were acting that way are acting that way. It's not hard to imagine that there were not a lot of applicants standing in line waiting to date Harvey Weinstein, because perhaps without money and power, he might have not been able to get a Valentine's date, and I know what that feels like. But he's especially disgusting, and we group him with the likes of Bill Cosby and Roger Ailes and Bill O'Reilly. Still, I have to admit that I had a negative gut reaction to hearing that George H.W. Bush was being put into their company. When a man in his 90s who's confined to a wheelchair gives himself permission to inappropriately touch women who just made the mistake of standing too close to his chair, I'm willing to insist that there is a difference between a confused, sick old man and the kind of predator that we have seen from these younger and more aggressive people in power. But I am not a woman who has been groped. I have an opinion, but this is a time to listen, not to the opinions of old white men. We need to listen to women who have been victimized. And yeah, especially as a younger pastor, I can tell you I've been groped by little old ladies in nursing homes, and anybody that works in nursing homes can tell you that some of those folks in wheelchairs have more hands than a room full of clocks. In my former parish, there was a little old German lady that used to, very short, and she'd come through the receiving line at the end of church, and she would always reach around and get a handful, which I found annoying, but, you know, not the end of the world. But then I noticed that she was going back to the end of the line and coming through again and again. But I didn't feel the need to call the media or call the police, because even though it is inappropriate touching, it is sexual harassment, I didn't feel objectified. I wasn't scared. I wasn't afraid of an assault. It didn't make me question my credibility. It had nothing to do with my career or my job security. And so where I can be fairly flippant about, well, men go through that too, men don't experience it the way that women do. I'm aware that men can be sexually assaulted. And, you know, in grad school, and I don't know how you ever come up with these numbers and are confident of it, but in grad school, we were told that 1/3 of women have their first sexual experience against their will, that 1/3 of women are sexually molested as a preteen. But 1/4 of men are, which those numbers seem terribly high to me. It is not reflective of my childhood experience, but people that seem to know about these things insist that men have suffered an awful lot of sexual abuse as children and that they are less likely to talk about it. But again, as an older white man, I insist on seeing a big difference between what George Bush did and what Harvey Weinstein did. But that doesn't mean that the women that have been groped by George H.W. Bush have not had terrible experiences in the midst of that, and fear and threat and all kinds of things that have undermined their self-confidence. And so, folks, there's just times that you have to listen. I'm aware that there are also false allegations, and there are people who try to make themselves famous or build their reputations through claims of victimization. But if you start talking about that right out of the gate, what you're really doing is telling all women to be silent about their experiences of being victimized. And so we have to give credibility ipso facto to a person right out of the gate and not try to silence, demean, or keep them from telling their stories, bearing in mind that there are false allegations and that there are terrible consequences from it. I know how delicate a thing that a reputation is, and yet our first response has to be to give credibility to a victim. We need to believe the people who come forward with complaints before the list gets as long as it got with Bill Cosby or with Harvey Weinstein. Weinstein insisted that he deserved a second chance. Now, folks, he has had 8 out-of-court settlements. What are you talking about, a second chance? You've had I think once you have to have an out-of-court settlement, that's your warning. But he's had a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth chance, and the industry just kept protecting him and paying out. I think what we're looking for Harvey is not a second chance. We're looking for a prison with no exit. That's kind of what we want for him. Still, I find myself changing the channel or skipping a podcast when this story comes on again. I feel like I've heard enough. And Congress is set to shift another huge tax burden onto the poor and the middle class in order to give a great tax cut to the super wealthy. Our president is threatening to get us into a nuclear exchange with either North Korea or maybe even Iran. It would not surprise me if Iran already has nuclear capability. So stories about men behaving like pigs, I don't think should take up the whole news cycle. There's other really big things going on. But as Winston Churchill says, it takes courage to stand up and speak, but it also takes courage to sit down and listen. And there are times when we've got to stop talking and start listening. We progressives are great at speaking. We don't have a wonderful history of listening. Most of us spent most of our lives being silenced by our employers, our parents, our pastors, our schools. We spent most of our education learning how to stand in line and how to color inside the lines. And when we finally broke loose and started learning how to get out of line and how to color without lines, it's been tough for us to find our balance again. You cannot accurately describe the world only from your perspective. I believe the whole world has a right to my opinion. That's why I write opinion columns. That's why I maintain a presence on the internet. And yet, as much as I may try to make it more universal, every opinion I express is the opinion of a white, heterosexual, North American, male, Protestant, at least heritage. The world doesn't revolve around anyone's navel. No one person gets to have the dominant perspective from which the rest of the world must be seen. Now, around here, we say that we want to be spiritual but not religious. And what we mean by that is that we want to be dismissive of church traditions and creeds and the rigors of dogma, and we want to elevate love. Love is our religion. And our collective rejection of creeds and dogmas and institutional authority has been vital to the growth in religious scholarship and biblical scholarship and the growth and evolution of philosophy. And this week, we observe the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, something that also may not have happened, but at least he did write 95 Theses, he did send it to his bishop, and people like to believe that he nailed it to the church door. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But he started the Protestant Reformation. And while that was liberating in many, many ways, you have to honestly say that it has also ignited very many wars, factions, heresies, abuses. The Catholic Church was and is guilty of any number of abuses. But folks, have you ever heard of the Assemblies of God? You know about Mormons? You know what the Church of Christ has done to women and minorities? Do you know what the Jehovah's Witnesses put their people through? So yeah, the Protestant Reformation was letting people out of a doctrinal and mental cage, but it also gave permission to an awful lot of craziness that has taken place under the rubric of different denominations. I appreciate the fact that the Unitarian Universalists have commonly taken up this theme in many of their congregations, but this too can be just a slogan. In the well-meaning passage from, or the well-known passage rather, from the 22nd chapter of Matthew that we used as our wisdom lesson today, Jesus is reported to have said that the greatest commandment is to love God, and the second is like it, to love one another. Now, I'm in no position to edit Jesus, but I'm pretty sure that Matthew did, so I'm going to edit Matthew. I'm going to insist that those two commandments are really just one commandment. Because if you think about it, what does it mean to love God? If you just stop there, period, full stop, love God, that doesn't mean a thing. I mean, it really doesn't mean a thing. How would you do it? How would you love God? I could tell you that I am devoted to the Persian god Ahura Mazda, but unless you know a lot more about Zoroastrianism than I assume that you do, that ain't going to mean a thing. The only way to be sincerely spiritual, the only way to have a faith that has substance, is to literally be on the side of loving others. And that will necessarily mean that we put our egos on hold, at least now and then, so that we can listen, learn, understand, empathize, and have real compassion for those around us. Bill Nye was not technically wrong from a scientific perspective. There is no race beyond our social constructs, but boy, howdy, do we have a lot of social constructs. And the world's religions are all more full of balloon juice than they are substance, and yet the social reality that we are living on the underside of the table is that there's still a lot of racism, there's a lot of sexual harassment, it's a nightmare. And people are still fighting and dying for their own version of an ancient religion that is still very important to them. Now, I'm proud to be among you folks. I am sincerely proud of your willingness to protest, to demonstrate, to write, to speak, and to advocate. But I don't want us to forget that love also demands that we listen, to see the table from another perspective, and to accept that our own views are not always either right or universal. Now, that's just my opinion. I'm going to leave it up to you to decide if I'm right.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.